Welcome back. Now, in this video, we're going to be looking at the fundamentals of the IELTS speaking module. Let's begin. So first, we'll start off with some basic information without which you really should not be going into the IELTS speaking exam. Here we go. So first of all, the whole IELTS speaking module is going to be 11 to 14 minutes in length. Okay, so this is the total time. This includes the total time for all three parts of the IELTS speaking section. So there are three parts in total. The first part is going to last between 4 to 5 minutes on average. The second part is going to last between 3 to 4 minutes. And then part 3 is going to last about 4 to 5 minutes. The next thing that you need to know is that in this test, you're going to be speaking to a real life examiner, meaning you're going to be talking to another person. So you're not going to be talking into a machine like you do in some of the other exams. Here, you're going to be interacting with a real person. Now, one thing that I want to point out to you is that examiners are not there to be your friends. Okay? They are there to grade you. They are there to see how well you speak English. Oftentimes, examiners will smile at your answers or they may even laugh along with you. And this leads students to often believe that just because the examiner is smiling or laughing along or seems to be friendly, that they're going to automatically get a good score. So keep in mind that the examiners are not there to be your friends. They may be nice to you, but still, at the end of the day, you still have to perform well. You have to know your English in order to get a high grade. The examiner is going to tell you when exactly the speaking section begins and when it ends. In fact, they're going to help you along. They're going to guide you for each of the different parts of the IELTS speaking section by telling you when each part begins and when it ends. Now, let's begin with looking at some more basic information, but pertaining to part 1 in particular. So let's break down what exactly you need to do in part 1 of the speaking section. So we've already mentioned that this is 4 to 5 minutes long. Next, here's how it's going to go. When you walk into that test room, the examiner is going to introduce himself to you or herself to you, and they're going to ask you to introduce yourself. Next, the examiner is going to ask you for your passport or your identity card. This is done so that the examiner can confirm your identity, so that they can make sure that you haven't sent your friend in your place to take the exam for you. Next, the examiner is going to begin part 1 by asking you a few general questions, and these general questions are usually on familiar topics such as your home, your hobbies, your family, and so on. So part 1 of the test should not be too hard for you because these are general questions on topics that you're already familiar with. Next, you need to know that there is no set number of questions. Now, usually there tend to be about 4 to 5 questions. However, there are no set number of questions, so really I cannot give you an exact number of questions that you can expect. This part 1 is more like a conversation. Now, in part 1, you don't need to extend your answers too much. You do need to extend. Don't give a yes or no answer. Don't give very short answers. That's going to get you a bad score. So what you want to do is you want to extend your answers, but you don't need to develop them at length. You're going to need to do this in part 2 of the speaking module, but not yet, not in part 1. In part 1, you should simply relax and talk naturally, as if you're talking to a friend. So like I said before, part 1 is supposed to be like a conversation that you're having with a friend. Now, part 1 is called the interview. And in this part 1, the examiner is going to ask you, you are the candidate, the examiner is going to ask you about yourself, about your home, work, studies, and other familiar topics, as we've already mentioned. So let me give you some examples of what type of questions the examiner may ask you in this section. Let's take food and cooking, for example. Now, food and cooking is a familiar topic. I'm sure that you eat food on a regular basis, so this is something that the examiner may ask you about. The examiner may ask you, what sorts of food do you like eating most? The examiner may further ask you, why do you like eating this food? Or why not? The next question may be, who normally does the cooking in your home? I'm sure someone in your home does the cooking, and again, this is a familiar topic, so this also qualifies as a question that the examiner may ask you in part 1. They may further ask you why or why not. Do you watch cookery programs on TV? Why or why not? In general, do you prefer eating out or eating at home? Why? Okay, so very general questions, very basic questions, and questions that you should really have no trouble answering since they deal with familiar topics. Now, here are some of the common topics that often appear in part 1. Now, there's going to be a bunch of them. We've got a total of 30 topics here, but don't let this overwhelm you. These are topics that are really about familiar things, about day-to-day things, and these are topics that I'm sure you already have a good understanding of. Now, all you need to do when the examiner asks you questions about these topics is you simply have to explain yourself. You simply have to express yourself. And we're going to look at exactly how to do that in much more detail later down the road. But right now, I just want to give you a brief overview of what to expect in the different parts of the speaking section. So go ahead and pause this video here if you need to and browse through these common topics. Make sure that you understand what kind of questions you may be presented with. Questions such as about work, study, hometown, art, childhood, and so on. Now, what I want to do here is I want to take a moment to just show you an example of what part 1 will look like when you walk into your exam. So I've got a brief video for you here. Let's take a look.
Good afternoon, my name's Stephen.
Good afternoon.
Can you tell me your full name, please?
My name's Priya Long.
Thank you. What shall I call you?
Please call me Priya.
Can I see your identification, please, Priya?
Sure, here's my passport.
Thank you, that's fine. Now, in this first part of the test, I'm going to ask you some questions about yourself. Do you work or are you a student?
Well, at the moment, I'm still studying.
Alright, so now that you know what to expect in part 1 of the speaking section, let us now talk about part 2. So let's begin with some basic information. Part 2 is 3 to 4 minutes long. In part 2, the examiner is going to give you what's called a task card. Basically, it's just a small card, it's a piece of paper, and on this piece of paper, there's going to be a question, and this is the question that you have to answer in part 2. The question is going to ask you to discuss a specific topic. Now, you're going to have 1 minute to prepare and to take notes. Now, this is optional, but I highly recommend that you take the time to prepare, to take notes, so that when you speak, it sounds coherent, fluent, natural, and organized. We're going to look at the exact strategy for how to take notes and for how to organize your ideas later down the road. The next thing that you need to know is that the examiner is going to ask you to talk for 1 to 2 minutes. Now, I want you to note that even though the examiner is saying that you should be talking for 1 to 2 minutes, ideally, you should be pushing towards 2 minutes. Try to speak for 2 minutes or close to it, because that's really going to help to boost your score. Try to avoid staying in the lower threshold. Try to speak as much as possible. Now, once your 2 minutes are over, 2 minutes is the maximum amount of time that you can speak for. At that point, the examiner is going to tell you that, hey, your time is up. Now let's move on to the next section. So once you're done with part 2, the examiner is then going to ask you follow-up questions, and these follow-up questions are going to be based on what you just talked about, And these follow-up questions are going to appear in part 3 of the speaking section. Part 2 is called presentation. Why? Because you are presenting certain ideas. You have 1 to 2 minutes to speak at length, and basically it's like you're doing a short presentation. So, here is a task card. So this is the task card that I just talked about. And in this task card, you have the questions. Now notice that this isn't just one question, rather you've got a certain topic and you've got a series of questions that you need to talk about. So let's go ahead and read this task card. Describe a house or apartment that someone you know lives in. You should say whose house, apartment this is, where the house or apartment is, and what it looks like inside. So you have to talk about these 3 things for this particular task card. But there's one more thing, and it's over here at the bottom, and it says, and explain what you like or dislike about this person's house or apartment. Okay, so really it looks like you have 3 things, but actually there are 4 questions that need to be answered for this question, for this task card. So again, we're going to go into a lot more detail of how to answer this in a really effective and easy way later down the road. But right now, let's just take a look at the overview of what to expect in this speaking section. Now, the instructions are going to be this. You will have to talk about the topic for 1 to 2 minutes. You have 1 minute to think about what you're going to say, and you may take some notes if it helps you. So those are the instructions. Now let's take a look at some common topics that often appear in part 2 of the IELTS speaking. So here are all the different topics. The topics can range from art to books to communication to your daily routine to exercise and all this other good stuff. Go ahead and pause this video now if you need to take a closer look at all of these common topics. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to move into a short video. Just like you saw for part 1, I want to show you this video so that you can see what part 2 looks like. Here we go.
Thank you. Now, in this part of the test, I'm going to give you a topic and I'd like you to talk about it for 1 to 2 minutes. Before you start, you'll have 1 minute to think about what you're going to say. You can make some notes if you wish. Do you understand what you have to do?
Yes.
Here's some paper and a pencil for making notes, and here is your topic. I'd like you to describe a memorable trip. Remember, you have 1 to 2 minutes. I'll stop you when the time is up. Can you start speaking now, please?
Okay, one trip that really stands out in my memory is a camping holiday I did in North Queensland in summer of 2014.
Alright, so now you know what part 1 and part 2 look like. Now let's go over the basics of part 3. So part 3 is 4 to 5 minutes long. That's the same length of time as part 1. In part 3, the examiner is going to ask you questions related to the same topic from part 2. Okay, this is important. These are basically follow-up questions. In part 3, the examiner is going to ask you follow-up questions based on your answers to part 2. Now, part 3 is quite similar to part 1. Now, what you need to do here, though, is you need to extend each answer a little bit more. You need to extend them a little bit more by maybe 1 to 2 extra sentences. So, for example, in part 1, you would give an answer that is 1 or 2 sentences long. In part 3, you have to give an answer that is 1 to 2 sentences more than part 1. So that means that you basically need to be talking and giving answers that range from between 3 to 4 sentences long. Okay? Now, these are just general guidelines. You can go a little bit more, you can go a little bit less, but ideally, you should try to maximize the amount of speaking time that you have. Ideally, a great answer would fit anywhere between 3 to 5 sentences for part 3. Now, in part 3, you're going to have the opportunity to talk about abstract ideas, to talk about abstract issues. So in this sense, part 3 is a little bit different because in part 1, you're going to be talking about very general ideas and topics that are familiar to you. Now in part 3, however, you're going to be talking about ideas that are a little bit more abstract, that are maybe not so familiar. We're going to look at exactly how to answer the questions in part 3 later down the road as well, but for now, let's just cover the basics. Similar to part 1, in part 3, there are no set number of questions. And again, the examiner, just like always, is going to inform you when the test is over. Alright, part 3 is called the discussion. This is because you're having a discussion with the examiner. Now here are the different types of questions that you can expect on this part of the test. So let's consider different types of home. Now let's consider this as a topic. Let's assume that in the previous part 2 of the speaking section, you ended up talking about homes. So if you spoke about homes or apartments or something like this in part 2 of the speaking section, then what's going to happen is in part 3, the examiner is going to follow that up with other similar questions that are basically on the same topic. So let's say that you talked about homes in part 2, and now the examiner is going to ask you about homes in part 3 as follow-up questions. So the examiner may ask you a question like this: what kinds of home are most popular in your country? Why is this? So you can notice that here we've got a two-part question. So what you would have to do here is first, you would have to answer the first part of the question and then the second part of the question. Another example may be, what do you think are the advantages of living in a house rather than an apartment? Here's another example. Do you think that everyone would like to live in a larger home? Why is that? Now, another topic may be finding a place to live. Now again, this is similar to talking about homes and apartments. So if you spoke about homes in part 2, in part 3, the examiner may very well ask you about finding a place to live, because this is a similar topic. So here's an example of a question. How easy is it to find a place to live in your country? Do you think it's better to rent or to buy a place to live in? Why? So do you see how the questions are a little bit more abstract? They're not quite on familiar topics. Rather, part 3 makes you think a little bit more. Here's our final example. Do you agree that there is a right age for young adults to stop living with their parents? Why is that? Okay, so those are the questions that you may see on part 3. Now, I quickly want to show you some common topics that often appear in part 3 of the course. So you may get questions on art, clothes, education, and so on. Go ahead and browse through this list now. Now, one thing that I want you to take note of is that the topics that you see in speaking parts 1, 2, and 3, they often overlap with each other. You may have noticed that topics like art, clothes, and education also appear in part 1 of the speaking section, in part 2 of the speaking section, and of course in part 3. So the topics can overlap. It's not necessary that you're going to only get one topic in a particular section or in a particular part of the speaking section. They can appear anywhere. So in that sense, the topics overlap with each other. But here's the thing. They don't just overlap with each other in the speaking parts. They even overlap with each other with other modules of the IELTS exam. For example, with the writing task 2. So for example, when you get a writing task 2 essay, you may have to talk about these same topics. So keep that in mind. Oftentimes, these topics overlap with each other, and for this reason, it's a good idea to know basic vocabulary surrounding these different topics. Now, don't worry, I've got you covered. We've created a great list of vocabulary words that you can use for your IELTS writing task 2 as well as for your IELTS speaking, and they are all divided up by the different topics. So this is going to make it really easy for you to express yourself regardless of the topic that you're given. But more on that later, more on that when we get to the vocabulary section. For now, what I want to do is I want to show you the third and final video, which is going to show you what part 3 looks like. So here we go.
We've been talking about a memorable trip, and I'd like to discuss with you one or two more general questions related to this. Let's consider first of all the way that people travel. How is the way people travel today different from the way they travelled 100 years ago?
Well, there have been enormous changes. I suppose one of the biggest influences has been the development of air transport.
Alright, congratulations on finishing this video. You now know exactly what parts 1, 2, and 3 look like. And I hope you have a better model in your head, a better understanding of what to expect from this test so that you can go in there feeling a little bit better understanding in your head. Now, we're going to expand upon that understanding and you're going to learn a lot more stuff in this course. So stay tuned and I'll see you in the next video where we talk about how you can get a high score. I'll see you there.